was basically the cry night of the camp. Well, there was really several this time. It was really interesting to see that. But it was this, it was going through and telling these, it was the speakers going up there and telling his story, but in that third person, so you didn't know it was him. You know, he was going through the strayed from God, you know, went to CIY, standing there like this the whole time, still as a statue, not doing anything. And then he reveals at the end how CIY changed his life and changed him, and then we got some good lock-in stories, which fortunately we haven't had any issues with here. But it was just so interesting to see how he was able to connect that to himself, but then also bring in the chains and how the weight of these chains is the weight of sin holding you down. And all Jesus wants to do is come up to us and say, give them to me, you are free. And so we're going to jump into 2 Kings 17 and kind of go through the awfulness that was Israel at this time. So the Israelites split into two kingdoms. We had the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. And the northern kingdom had, I think it was 20 kings, and every single one of them was bad. And then you had Judah, who had, I think, 16 kings, and there was 2 or 3 of them that were good. And so today we're going to go through the downfall of Israel, which is the northern kingdom that had no good kings. And it really shows the sin cycle that we see in Judges, where really that one of the last lines in Judges, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own heart, really encapsulates why Israel fell. And so Peter read for us verses 7 and 8 earlier. So I'm going to jump down a little bit farther to verse 14, where it says, however, they did not listen, but stiffened their necks like their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They rejected his statutes and his covenant which he made with their fathers, and his warnings which he warned them. And they followed vanity and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which the Lord had commanded them not to do like them. They forsook all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made themselves molten images, even 2 calves, and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. So this is kind of like a really quick checklist on everything not to do, which frankly the Israelites are pretty good at giving that to us, but then also when we look at our lives we realize we're pretty good at giving that pretty much that same checklist. And so going through this, we have this list of reasons for why Israel fell. And it's a dark story, it's a sad story. The Babylonians, with their exile, were fairly brutal about it. We'll get into this a little bit later, but they burned down the temple of God. They brought out the slaves, and they brought out the Israelites as slaves, and captured all of those who had run out the gate. And it was just a hopeless, hopeless, hopeless time for Israel. And so if we jump over to chapter 25, we're able to see the actual downfall of Israel. It begins with Nebuchadnezzar besieging Jerusalem. Now in the 9th year of his reign, and on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came. He and all his army against Jerusalem, camped against it, and built a siege wall around it. So the siege wall was literally as it sounds. It's a fortification, so no one goes in, no one goes out. It's how you starve a city, because they can't get to their crops that are outside of the city gates. They can't get to the water that's, outside of the city gates. They cannot leave their city, and so they're forced to effectively starve to death inside their own homes because of there's nothing getting in and nothing getting out. And then on top of that, in verse 3, we get, on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then the city was broken into, and all the men of war fled by night by way of the gate between the 2 walls inside the king's garden, through the Chaldean, though the Chaldeans were all around the city. And they went by way of Arabah, but the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Again, this is worst case scenario. This is Jerusalem. This is supposed to be the home of the Israelites, where the temple is. This is where they go and travel to be with God. And here they are getting uprooted and thrown out and enslaved and destroyed because they couldn't follow God's command. And as we go through the rest of chapter 25, we see where it just doesn't get any better for them. It goes into detail about how the bronze and the silver and the gold of the temple were ripped up and melted back down to be brought to Babylon so that they could use it for how they wanted to. These things that were supposed to be images for God got broken down and torn apart and removed entirely so that the Babylonians could add to their immense wealth. When going through the conquest and the conquest of the Promised Land, before we get King Solomon or King David or get the split kingdoms, we see by just following God's command, every step of the Israelites' way is paved in gold for them, and it is just a complete sweep for them. And yet, anytime they turn away from God, it makes things a million times harder for them. And so we get Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who is, at this point, I believe, one of the most, if not the richest empire in the world at this time. And so you have to imagine the kind of forces that are going against the Israelites, who are just recently dealt with their own civil war. They split up. The tribes aren't really meshing the way they should. And so there's issues between tribes, and the kings bring in non-Levite priests, so there's worship that's getting mixed in, and it's just not what God intended for the Israelites. And so then we get Nebuchadnezzar coming in, who, if God was on the Israelites' side, would have lost. But it's that disobedience and that consequences for sin. And then in verse 12 of chapter 25, we get one of the more important things of this. The captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. So there's this idea in shepherding of the remnant. So if a lion, tiger, or bear goes and kills your sheep, you need some kind of proof to say, look, this is the sheep and it is dead. And so what you would have to do is go and wrestle that animal for like a hoof or an ear or some small part of that sheep. So the shepherd could bring that piece back to the landowner and say, look, here is what happened to your animal. It's not on me, that sort of thing. And this in verse 12 is exactly that remnant. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, we'll read about the other exile of Judah, and then just that continued sin cycle where they're getting farther away from God, and the consequences keep getting worse and keep getting worse and keep getting worse. Yet there's always just that little string of hope where we can see that God is still working for his people, through his people, sometimes not through his people. And so with this remnant, we get those that remained in Jerusalem after the siege are what we call the remnant. And so with that, they kind of re-spark that bringing back the temple back to Jerusalem kind of idea. Obviously, as kings come and go, they want to, but it's those that were still in Jerusalem at the end of the exile were the ones that really brought King Cyrus in and allowed him to help them. If there wasn't a remnant there, then there would be a vacuum, and some other people group would come in and wipe out the temple, wipe out any remnant of God. So again, it's that little string of hope in there that says, yes, it's bad, but it's not all bad. And so as we're going through in verse 22, we get the new governor of the Israelites. At this point, they are officially called Jews because the Jews are the post-exilic people as they're brought out of Israel and Judah and into the foreign lands is officially when they get called Jews. So now we can move from Israelites to Jews. So if I do that, that's why. So we get the Jews that are out there, But for the people that were left in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had left, he appointed Gedaliah, the son of Achim, son of Stephan, over them. When all of the captains of the forces, they and their men, heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah governor, they came to Gedaliah to Mizpah, namely Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and Jonathan, the son of Kareah. Now these names they mean something in terms of who the people are, but for our translation today, it doesn't really matter what their names mean. Basically, these are just the other governors of Babylon. They're getting together with Gedaliah and basically saying, hey, you probably shouldn't do this. In verse 24, we get Gedaliah swore to them and their men and said to them, do not be afraid of the servants of the Chaldeans. Live in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will be well with you. He's telling these Israelites, these Jews, that if you just worship the king of Babylon, if you basically just continue doing what you've been doing, but instead of the Baals and the Ashtoreths, you move over to the Babylonian gods, everything's going to be fine for you. But again, that's not what God wants for his people, and so we're going to see how that's not exactly true. Then I was saying about that hope. We get that in verse 27. Now it came about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month of the 27th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he became king, released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiakim changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion for each day, all the days of his life. So whenever I say that the Israelites were dragged out of Jerusalem, the Babylonians were rather gruesome about it. There's this issue when you try and tell a free person from a slave person that they all kind of tend to look like people, and that kind of causes problems when you're trying to figure out who's a slave and who's free. So the Babylonians, and I believe it was also the Assyrians, had a really, really good idea for this. They would get a big fish hook looking thing and insert it underneath the sternum and come out the rib cage. That way you were left with very distinct scars, and you would be chained together by these hooks. That way you couldn't escape as they were marching you from Jerusalem to Babylon. Think about that for a second, just that brutality in the Jews realizing that this is their reality, being no more than slaves strung together with fish hooks, so they will always be slaves. They will always have that mark of slavery in those scars. And then we get to verse 27, and we realize that God is still working for his people. Jehoiakim, well, he was a king of Judah. There's more than that. We know David's in the line of Jesus, and then, we go through the lineage in Matthew, and then, we read through and we see all these names and we read them, and it's like I was reading earlier with the different people who were talking to Gedaliah. It just doesn't make sense until we put it in perspective. So this section here, verses 27 through 30, is a continuation of the line of Jesus. And so the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he should have been killed, or at the very least he should have been blinded and then strung up like all the rest, and then brought in, basically it would have been made mockery of, maybe in the king's service, probably not. You generally don't want a foreign king, especially one that you've conquered in your own, your own little circle, because that's how you deal with things like assassination attempts and that sort of thing. And so to see that Jehoiakim was released from prison, he changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly. That shouldn't have happened. feel like I say this a lot every time I preach up here, but it's just this reality that God works in ways that humans just doesn't make sense to us. And so with this, I want to close with just this reminder that no matter how bad life might get, no matter how bad our circumstances might be, whether it be from our own sin or whatever else it might be, whatever else we try and blame, the reality is that God is still working for us. And as he shows continuously through the Old Testament, he always has a plan for his people. His people don't always follow his plan, but when they don't, he makes concessions to his plan and still brings them deliverance. Out of Egypt, they complained, and so they had to wander around the desert for 40 years to eliminate that whole generation. But then afterwards, they were brought into the Promised Land, and they still messed up, they still fell short, they still weren't good enough to be God's perfect people, but it doesn't change the fact that God was perfect for his people. So as we're going through our weeks this week, I want us to think about this, and I hope it comes to mind whenever you do hit a rough patch, because it's life and stuff happens and it gets rough and it's not easy. But even on the darkest day of the darkest hour of the darkest month of the darkest year, there is always going to be that little bit of hope out there, that little bit of light that's God saying, hey, I'm still here for you. I still have a plan for you. You're still working with me. I'm still working with you. It's this process that we call sanctification. There's a really easy way to explain it. You get yourself up here, then there's the cross down here, which is kind of where you meet your lowest point, when you meet the cross, and you accept Jesus, and then you bounce back up. And so we like to give these nice smooth motions, but the reality is it's like a mountain. There's peaks and there's valleys, there's high spots, there's low spots, there's plains, there's flat spots. It's a journey. And one of the things we really talked about in CIY was this idea of steps. It's one step at a time. Your baptism is a step towards Jesus. Talking to someone, talking to your one, inviting them to church is another step. And so I want to encourage you as you're going through to remember that God has us right in his palm, as we did in the children's moment. Jesus is for us. We put our hands out to receive his blessings that he gives us daily. And so as desolate and desperate and just as awful as it might be, we can always put our hands out and just ask God, can you give me one blessing today so I know you're still here? Pray with me. Father, thank you for this opportunity to come and preach, and this opportunity to work with the kids here. I just thank you for this opportunity we had at CIY. And just help us as we're going through our week to remember to look for that little spot of light. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to have one last song, and then we'll close.